Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining this amazing webinar. My name is Tony Joy. I'm with Sound Particles. We are very, very excited to be doing this webinar with our friends at Apogee. And I want to start with giving a huge shout out to the company because this is, Women's History Month. And for those of you who didn't know, Apogee is actually a woman-owned company for decades. So a huge shout out to Betty, who is the CEO and founder of Apogee. And George is representing Apogee, joining us here from sunny Los Angeles, California. That's where I am based as well. And we have the maestro himself, Ross Lara, joining us from Colorado. And before we jump in and do introductions in detail, quick housekeeping rules. First of all, like I said, thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time. We really, really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A section. My amazing colleague coming live from Portugal, Joao, is on Zoom as well. Joe will be keeping an eye on the questions, thoughts, comments you might have, which we will bring up towards the tail end of the webinar. We have some giveaways and few other goodies for everyone who's joined, all that to come in. So why don't we start with quick intros? So like I said, George is from Apogee. George, would you like to introduce yourself in a few quick words?
Absolutely. Excited to be here. My name is George. I work for Apogee Electronics here as our product evangelist, which means I get to take the value of our products and help kind of take them to the broader market and make sure that people understand that aspect of it. I got into this from being a musician, and then funny enough, I only ever intended to record demos and ended up making a small recording business out of it later on through the use of our products over the years. And I think one of the things that's so cool about digital audio is it allows everything to really truly be democratized. So in a session like this, it's really amazing that we get to throw back tips and tricks and help you hopefully manage to get your creative potential out of what you can put into your thought process as a musician and as an artist.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, George. Rose, my friend, musician, composer extraordinaire. Would you like to introduce yourself real quick?
Thank you, Tony. Great to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Ross. I'm based up in the mountains of Colorado. Been writing and producing music for a long time, and just a pleasure to be here. We got my Logic session pulled up and looking forward to diving into some of these plugins with y'all.
Amazing. Thank you. So one quick thing before we hit spacebar and hear the Logic session, one thing I wanted to point out is if you watched our previous webinars, we've done lots of stuff on spatial and creating music in spatial. And I think sometimes our customers often think, oh, Sound Particles is a spatial only company. Actually, nothing could be further away from the truth. We are actually a audio music company, which is format agnostic. What that means is everything we make works amazingly well on stereo. And of course, they are spatial ready as well. So in this webinar, we wanted to focus on traditional stereo workflows. Again, Ross himself is a pioneering composer in spatial. Now, that does not mean he can only compose in spatial, right, Ross? So we are going to be listening to some amazing stuff that Ross has made. And with that, Ross, why don't we hit spacebar?
Sounds great. Here we go, guys. Here, just play about a minute and 10 seconds or so of a piece of music, and then we'll dive into how we went about producing and arranging and mixing some of it with the plugins at hand. Here we go.
Let's do it.
Okay, all right. So that's that. There's more to be heard, but we'll get to that in a bit. Tony, what do y'all think so far?
I think it's brilliant. I just want to ask, like, what was your creative intention when you were creating that piece of music? Did you want to create something that was friend focused or all around you, or what was your creative intent?
Well, it's, I have cinematic music or just a cinematic vibe in mind altogether for throughout the entire piece of music, but it's quite dynamic. If you get to this wall of sound over here that I'll play y'all in a bit, this is like throwing the kitchen sink, and there's orchestral elements and lots of electronic elements. And then starting in the beginning, you just have like sound design textures made from sound particles and just ambiance and just drones and things like that. And then, in the meat and potatoes of this track, we introduce drums and percussion and different types of sonic and melodic, dynamic aspects of it all. There's kind of a lot of space and width happening with these drums, and there's arpeggios with the synths, but then this part right here just all sucks into this raunchy, dirty synth and bass aspect. So there's quite a few things that we can do, say with plugins like Energy Painter and Reverb plugins
Right.
like Spaces, to help tell the story sonically and mixing wise and production wise, not just musical notes on a piece of paper.
Absolutely. I will pass on to George in a minute, but one thing I realized is when you try to create depth in music or sound design or any sense of audio, two things is how two ways or two methods is what helps our brain think there's space, right? One is you have
Yes.
to have a virtual space, like a reverb. Like if you close your eyes in a cathedral, you feel like you're in a cathedral because there's a space that's reflecting sounds. And the product that really does that well here is the clear mountain spaces. And the second thing that our brains really look for is a sense of movement. If there's a bird in flight, then you feel like,
Mhm.
oh, there's a movement there. And how did that happen? That's where the energy panel comes in. But I will let George introduce Clear Mountain Spaces real quick. Can you tell us about the thought process behind the product and Bob's thoughts behind the plugin itself, and a quick history of how maybe Apogee got into a pioneer in the hardware sector, how you guys started doing plugins, and just explain the thought process, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. So, one of the interesting things is that as a company that's been in digital audio as long as we have, a lot of the kind of history and legacy of that stuff affects our product development cycle. So, the first plugins that actually were made were primarily made so that they actually would function on our hardware. Back in the era where people were running off of the Ensemble and the Element, some of our first products that were in the software space were stuff that was able to run on the digital signal processing of those particular interfaces. And funny enough, both of those interfaces at the time that they debuted were not advertised as having DSP. One of our engineers
Nice.
figured out a really clever way of using this FPGA programming to make it so that things that were automating certain control features, like imagine changing between mic preamps to line level signals to affecting levels to powering the unit on and off. He figured out that there was a way of incorporating signal processing at that level. And that's kind of how we started in on our plugin development. And our objective was just really to make tools that were able to make things more satisfying at the point of capture. Clear Mountain's domain was probably our biggest endeavor because that plugin was created from this perspective of trying to capture Bob's thought process. So it's kind of funny. If you look at domain, a lot of people will look at it as like a particular delay and reverb plugin, but there's all kinds of weird stuff that's captured into it, like things like the SSL's blur, which was literally a hardware setting that was just a part of his chain and his workflow. With Spaces, things are a bit different. We really try to make this particular plugin stripped down. That was the idea, was to take things within domain and make this super accessible. And for, I think, a really important reason. When a lot of people are creating music, one of the biggest challenges is creative flow. And I think that oftentimes, as many plugins as we have, I'm always really like just incredibly fascinated by how good plugins have become and how abundant they are and how many
Right.
people have stuff out there, right? But the whole thing is like, as an artist, how does it make you better? How does it make you work in a way that is able to put your ideas down better? And so the real thing I want to kind of share about the thought process behind how we made Spaces was it was all about creating efficiency for the user. And so one of the things I think many people don't reflect on is, how does your digital workflow align to your creative intention? And
Right.
in many cases, as much as I love to obsess over a snare sound and deal with how you're dealing with mid-range and low mids and high mids and cutting things out and notching it into your mix, so commonly we think about these things that are like 10% changes. And a lot of times what we need to do is make things so that there's less option paralysis and we can continue through our process. So by removing a number of these features and making it so that you've got just incredible options you can go to that you can trust and count on, our hope is that we make it so it's easier for artists to create. And so that's what we see inside of Spaces here. We see a super stripped down layout here that has 3 of Bob Claremont's favorite spaces here, one being Apogee Studios, where I'm actually coming to you from. Fun fact, this actually used to be a warehouse area, and if you've ever seen our KCRW broadcasts, you'll notice it is a pretty big venue that is actually kind of modeled after Bob's background with CBGBs back in the day, trying to have a really live, really exciting space that he could have a full recording studio function as well as a live space. And so you'll find that these 3 spaces, Studio, Mix This, and Roscoe, those are going to go from kind of a smaller space into larger and larger spaces. And we've really tried to strip these things down so that they're, again, completely interesting and usable for every one of these settings, but you're not completely jarred up by how many different things you can select. You can really go in here, have things that you originally put on just to continue your process that end up working in the final mix because they're so well tuned to it. Because of this, a couple things to note about these individual spaces and how to work with them. Again, thinking about them as from short to long is a very easy one to think about. They also kind of have different capture processes. So something like Roscoe is done with ribbon mics, tends to be one of the warmest sounding. If you listen to that versus Studios, which is a much smaller space, a lot more live, it feels a little different to how you can deal with it. But all these can be completely combined too. There's not anything that is discrete and unchangeable about it. But there are a few kind of features inside the box that a lot of people completely miss. So these are a couple tricks that we'd like you to take a look at here. One of those is the de-esser that's built in. A lot of people see that little de-ess button between input and our pre-delay and don't have a clue what that is about. That is actually a really neat feature that allows you to de-ess the signal chain, which is great, especially if you're throwing a reverb onto vocals, allows a lot of these things to sit easier. Same way that EQ is built in. EQ here is a great way of making it so you can either darken things up so that those reverbs are not affecting what's happening in your high end and your presence and kind of sit behind the vocal, or you can a lot of times use this to kind of change your EQ shape without actually changing the primary source, which I think a lot of people find is a really useful way of fitting things into a mix without changing the timbre that they really like about that individual instrument's capture. And then finally, pre-delay, kind of forgotten art here inside of delay, but pre-delay, especially when you deal with a small slapback amount, has a really interesting way of capturing a specific time and vibe. Reverb tends to go in trends, as many things in audio, and especially if we're trying to get something to sound like it's from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all these have different aesthetics, and you'll find, I think, that when playing around with pre-delay, this is going to give you some of the secret sauce towards the older sounds especially.
That's
Well said.
wonderful. Yeah, I think Ross earlier commented on how easy it is to use these plugins. And here at Sound Particles, we also take pride in creating plugins that's very intuitive and right brain centric, right? There's complex maths that goes behind the plugins. At the same time, we want to make sure artists like Ross can just open up a plugin and get into the flow. So in that sense, I feel like both Apogee and Sound Particles, all these products pair so well, and that's why we wanted to do this webinar. On that note, Ross, what are your thoughts on those Clear Mountain Spaces and Energy Panel and how they pair? Can you show us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a reverb junkie. I have dozens and dozens of reverb plugins, and they all have, like George said, a unique aesthetic to them. One of the most important and notable elements of Spaces that I've learned about it so far is that it just sounds very live and has a lot of character. The brightness of it doesn't sound like it's a synthesized brightness. It feels and sounds quite real. Like I'm right there in either those chambers or halls or whatever the algorithms were used to create the plugins. So it's delightful and it's super easy. This is an electronic piece of music that we heard, and I think it's going to be fun to show off these plugins in an electronic format as well. No doubt there'll be a vocal or an acoustic guitar's best friend, but in electronic music production, these tools are very useful too. In this section right here, this the crescendo riser section, if I bypass what I've included on these on this chain, I thought that this assortment of risers and tension and crescendo was a bit too harsh. And from a mix standpoint as well, there was some clashing frequencies and things were getting a bit cluttered. I'm going to play this section without spaces and energy panner, and then walk you through the process of how those two plugins softened and added more dimension and more space and depth to fit into the mix a bit better. So here is this riser section. All right, I'm just going to solo that so you can hear just more of the intricate details of it all. Okay, so it all sounds great, but I think it could be improved, especially as I get further in the mix phase of this piece. So first and foremost, I put spaces directly on this bus. If I enable it and bring it into the fold here, I just experimented with these three algorithms, the three main reverb algorithms within the plugin. I will bypass all of these and we'll do this live and we'll do it together. So here we go. Apogee Studio. And I'm also going to turn up the wet parameter real quick, just so we can hear it from the get-go. And then we'll bring that back to rise and go from a dry to a wet sound. Let's go dry. Let's bring that back in. These input configuration buttons above this second reverb parameter are awesome. If you hover your mouse over each icon, it will explain to you what each one does. So this equal sign creates the reverb into a stereo signal. And George, feel free to jump in here if I am missing any of the technical details. The middle button sends the reverb to stereo sum to mono. So it's taking a stereo input and summing it into mono. And the third one is a reverb in a swap stereo. So that can create some cool phasing or interesting modulation or something like that between the sources of audio going into this plugin. Did I miss anything there, George, that you'd like to add?
No, you're correct. The only one that's weird there is the sum to mono goes back to stereo. So it's just interesting in terms of trying to figure out whether you want to narrow or widen your mix. If you're trying to get things that hit in a more direct way, I think that's going to be where people really prefer that. And then, you know, Ross, I know we were talking about this recently, but, you know, that reverse stereo can be such an interesting way of creating a different impact of things that feels more exciting too. Just a totally different way of going about it.
Totally. All right, well, let's mix in this second parameter here. So without it, with it. So let's just go back to without the plugin real quick and see where we're at. It's a bit more in our face. Put it on. It's a bit wider, creating some more depth. Let's add Roscoe in. Without it. Wow, it really livens up. It adds some additional harmonics to that. I'm digging that. Experiment with the pre-delay, just like any other reverb plugin. Helps create space and time. There's clearly not any transient type material in this, but pre-delays will always add value to what you're trying to do with reverb. So I like it right around this area. You can then also activate the EQ. Is this a post fader or a pre-fader? I believe it's post, right?
It has the ability to be both. That's one of the interesting little things about that is you can choose which way it's inserted.
Heck yeah.
Nice.
So just going to roll off a little bit at the top. Here's this. Awesome. So now let's just bring that mix parameter back down. So that's going to rise with the instruments. Starts off here. Cool. So that's just the first part of the process. I'm
Right.
actually going to adjust that curve a little bit. Now with a plugin like Energy Panner, so the Energy Panner is reading the sound material, and then it's going to move the audio signal around per these 4 very familiar parameters that you see on any compressor out there: threshold, ratio, attack, and release. And if you need a friendly reminder of what each of these parameters do, if you just hover your mouse over each knob, it gives you a little description on the bottom part of the plugin. So like, for instance, threshold says the minimum input signal level needed for the panning effect to start. Just like a compressor, any audio signal that goes beyond that threshold line, the compressor is going to react and start to work. So this is great.
Hey,
Let's
Ross,
hear. Yeah.
if you don't mind, I just want to jump in and do a very quick intro to those who might not be familiar with Energy Panner at all. So a quick recap, this is a plugin that's a panner. It does have parameters you might see on a compressor like threshold, ratio, like Ross mentioned, attack and release. But I want to make it clear that the plugin does not do any compression whatsoever. It's purely a panner. All it does is it pans based on the loudness of the signal. And that's what we are about to hear in the example. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, you're welcome. So if by default, when you just load up the plugin, we can just start experimenting with some of the parameters and controls here. So you can see the audio wanting to do its thing. You can experiment and do really anything you want. You can change the way the direction of the way audio wants to be, or the way the direction audio needs to go. However, I really enjoy using this plugin with a sidechain input, and that's what particularly I want to show you now. So if I go here to sidechain and I go to, I want to have a sidechain input of my pads here. I'm just going to play these pads by themselves, and you can start to see this movement here. It's like a tremolo effect. So what if we could have that tremolo effect of those pads affect this crescendo effect, or this crescendo riser here? So let's go to find the Starlight pads somewhere in here. Let's see, where are they? There's a lot of tracks. There we go. And then if you activate the sidechain input on the plugin, now the input signal going, there's an input signal going into Energy Panner to affect the audio source. So it's very subtle right there. Let's just play this through, and you can hear very dramatic effects if we mess around with these thresholds and the attack release and the ratio.
Hey, Ross.
We saw. Yes, Tony?
Sorry, I was about to say, I'm curious how it would sound in the sliding mode. So you see how you had 2 tabs, right at the top in the plugin.
Yeah, I'll get to that in just a second.
Oh, perfect.
One moment. So if we just go through attack and release here and just play with those, we can see how it sounds. If it's a slow attack, things are going to be moving slowly. If it's a fast attack, just like in a compressor, things can move quickly. Release. So it's moving to the rhythm and the sound of that pad that has that tremolo gated effect. Going into sliding, then the audio signal will slide around and pan around. It's pretty cool. You can move things around here. You can also create custom points. You can start things left, right, center, things of that nature. And you can just sit here and adjust and play as much as you want. And you can see then when the sound resolves, the panning has resolved. So bringing that back into the mix here. It's pretty cool. So taking all of those two treatments off. Before, it's a subtle mix thing. And then bring it back in. Pretty cool. So the sky's the limit with any of these plugins that you have in your arsenal. And these plugins are simple in nature with simple user interfaces, but they can become quite elaborate, and you can go as deep as you wish with any of these plugins, which is awesome. Another cool instance is a few measures later in this track. There's this kind of sustained vocal drone. I'll just play this by itself. It's just side chaining to go with everything else. But we can add movement to that vocal drone as well. So this very aggressive main pad that has lots of harmonic distortion just sounds something like that. So let's sidechain that signal into this energy panner. Go here, drop down. I've already assigned it the OB6 drop. And now that frequency and that amplitude content is going to process and affect how this energy panner works. That's with it. Here's without it. With it. It's dancing. It's like panning acrobatics. Pretty cool. So that's another great little instance of you can just create some movement and depth and excitement in the mix. I'll just play this section back just a little bit right here. This is one of those instances where I might automate the dry wet parameter and energy panner. So I might start it off relatively dry and then increase that movement as the track progresses. You can see that parameter moving here. I adjusted the attack parameter and now it's not moving so violently or vigorously. It's a bit smoother, and this could be great too. And then the last part, yes?
You know what? You're gone, man. You just read my mind. Go for it.
The last element of this plugin that's really great is you can now change the style and the type of output that you have. You have just good old traditional stereo. I'll play this back so you can hear the differences. We also have XY, mid-side, Lumlin, am I pronouncing that correctly, binaural. And then of course, if you're working in Atmos or anything like that, or any surround sound format, you have all these other formats as well. I'm in 714 often when I'm working on Atmos stuff. I'll just go through some of those so for you to hear. Check this out. So there's stereo. Here's XY. Mid-side. Wow, in that instance, mid-side brought out a lot of space and depth for that, which is pretty cool. So yeah, I'd sit here and tweak for 5 minutes and find something that I really like. And gosh, I end up using these plugins quite often. And especially when you enter the Atmos world, when you can do that with 12 speakers is pretty special.
Right. And Rose, thank you. That was really, really amazing. So, I just want to point out one quick thing about the Energy Panner's stereo modes. So as Rose was showcasing, there's XY, there's traditional stereo. What that means is, if you look at the sphere in the center, the GUI, the idea is you'll have virtual mics in the dead center. So you're changing the polar patterns of those mics. If you say XY, there's XY mics in that dead center of that sphere. And if you choose MS, you're placing virtual microphones inside the plugin to capture those movements. But coming back to the topic of our webinar, these two plugins, it's like, and other panels we make, it seems like it's a match made in heaven, right, George? Like Clear Mountain Spaces and Energy Panner or Brightness Panner. So Brightness Panner is another plugin that Sound Particles makes. Same concept, instead of using loudness, that plugin uses frequency content to pan things around. But no matter which panner you use, pair it with an amazing reverb plugin like Clear Mountain Spaces, suddenly your music has so much depth and so much immersion, even when you're working in stereo. And that's just magic.
Totally. Yeah, and I think especially like those of us that work a lot of the time in the box too, there's a lot of interesting space and texture to be had out of these kind of decisions, and so much creativity to be had too, where you don't have to explore conventional spaces either, You're not limited by the contents of your studio.
I like to experiment with some spaces on some of these introductory beats, if I may.
Please.
Yeah, awesome. So if you guys remember these in the beginning of the track, so let's just create a new bus for that. Spaces, intro, drums. That's my all-time bass bus. So let's bring that up.
Well, and Ross, while you're bringing this up, I was curious to ask you in particular, what do you think about the idea of having kind of a default workflow that you're used to versus experimenting? And when do you go to choose one versus another for a lot of aspiring producers looking to work either more efficiently or be happier with their results?
This is probably a really great time, George, for you to mention Bob's quote that you were talking about of even discussing presets and just wanting to have a blank slate a lot of times and just have the music tell him and speak to him about what to do. I'm very much in that same mindset, and you can dive more into what you were telling me off air, George, but gosh, I have tried so long to be a template guy. And like when I'm writing for a game or a movie, I've tried to create all of those templates for my sessions and have all kinds of stuff. But just so often, I just like having a blank slate and building from there and just allowing the inspiration, the energy, the music, how I'm feeling, like just to teach, just to talk and to inform me of what to do next. You can get chords and a melody out sometimes very quickly. If you're lucky, that could be the first thing you do when you sit at the piano, and you can get like the story out there and you can get the song written. But then when it comes to producing and mixing and programming and all the conceptual musical sound design, just like turning knobs and just, I'll experiment with different things. Something as simple as this, like with the beats, I might have a Valhalla reverb, or I can use Spaces reverb, and I'll try a variety of different kinds, and I'll just go through this elaborate plugin list here and figure it out, or I'll use my hardware or whatever. So it's just, also, I'd like to say that you guys just got to change things up too. You can get complacent and comfortable with similar or same workflows for years and years and years, and then all your shit ends up sounding the same. I would highly, highly recommend just to always keep changing the process. You change your outcome, and just, try to start with, fresh pages to draw and paint on, but in the musical way. Let's check out some of these beats, with this reverb plugin. Man, you hear those like tonal toms with that Apogee Studio? It's sick. without. And then what I might do here is I'm going to boost this this notch here. See if there's a place that I don't like. So what I'll do in this instance is I kind of like how that's feeling. I'm going to crank the living daylights out of the send just to really hear what's happening with the drums, and then I'm going to bring it back down and level it out a bit. Yep, it just brings a little bit of life, and that's the idea of these spaces and these Reverb plugins. You know, you don't hear a lot of it, but when it goes away, you feel the difference. So this is just bringing just that extra little bit of life, and if you do this with every element of your record making process, then you really get some exciting results. So that's wonderful. I'm going to continue to dial that in, and as I enter the final mix phase of this track. Yeah, and then also one more instance of just, these are, you know, gosh, a lot of you could probably relate on this seminar. You know, we got a lot of cool outboard instruments and pianos and acoustic instruments and so forth. Oh boy, am I glitching? Okay, I think I'm back now.
You're good.
But we also have plenty of in the box instruments that, you know, sometimes can feel a little bit lifeless. In this classic case here, I just have some choirs happening at the end of this track. And I just use spaces to just beef them up and add some of that harmonic modulation with whatever those spaces and chambers and plates are that the plugin is using. Here's without any of the send, and I'll bring that up as well for y'all to see it. And then also, speaking about EQ, you know, we have this EQ here. I also just loaded up a Pro Q3 and did an additional dip right there. So there's a lot of resonance in these kind of fake choirs and these virtual choirs around that 3K range. So I just attenuate that. That's before it enters the Spaces plugin. Here it is. Let's crank it. Without. With. So just add some body, some girth to it all. So yeah, fun stuff. It's just those subtle little things that make a difference in your mix phase and just the harmonic characterization of your instruments and your parts in your track.
Awesome. Hey, Ross, I just want to bring back a topic that we've discussed at length off screen before many times, is subtle movements, right? So Energy Panner in the workforce examples we showed earlier was moving things from the speakers to the center or behind, or, you know, it was dramatic movements. But one thing I use it a lot for, especially, is actually with vocals and choirs, right? You can also set Energy Panner to like micro movements. It almost simulate head movements, right? So something like this choir, you can actually move the dots. You can move it manually, right? You can drag and drop it, and then set it to a small level where your brain feels like, okay, there's some movement. It's not running around like crazy, but at the same time, it feels like that sound just came alive, just because no one stands still and sings in a choir. People move their heads. That's what makes a real choir a real choir. So by using plugins like Energy Panner or Brightness Panner at very subtle levels, you can actually add that pinch of salt to your dish that is music, right?
Yeah, you know, oh, pardon me, guys. That's just the dog. That's you know, when you were explaining that, Tony, I also thought of like, that's just the beauty of like what LFOs do. And LFO, you know, just that subtle modulation. You have a source and you can just have very subtle things happen with LFOs, and it's just awesome. And that's the beauty of Energy Panner, Brightness Panner, things of that nature. Like if I come here, say to, let's do this OB6 art, and I put a plugin like Energy, or let's do Brightness Panner, which is another great plugin here. So let's just hear this part without the plugin. So Brightness panner is taking in more of the pitch and frequency content of the sound source and panning things around via the reaction of those two elements, pitch and brightness. So let's just dabble with this a little bit and see what happens.
Right there. See, it feels like it's pulsing.
It's dancing across. It rises.
Can you bypass and put it back on just so we can hear the difference?
Yeah, and that was cool. The filter cutoff on the OB6 synth was opening up, and while that was happening,
Right.
the plugin was reading that opening of the frequency content of the filter and going. So here's without. With.
Nice.
Make go really slow with this. Pretty cool. So yeah, just the sky's the limit with these plugins. So you can just make it dance as much as you want, or it could be just so subtle in terms of just the aspect of humanizing these performances just a little bit. If I had a vocal piece right now, like that would be so fun to do with harmonies or background vocals, like, you know, vocal stacks that are just, you know, doubles versus harmonies, and you can have that subtle movement react with a sidechain input or something like that too.
Yeah, that would be another webinar. You know, we should do one with Clear Mountain Spaces and Density, which is a chorus plugin we make as well. But hey, we
Yeah.
are almost hitting the 45-minute mark. I just want to hear that initial riser you played for us earlier. It
Yeah.
sounded so cool.
Yeah. So here's without the bells and whistles. And this is like just a mix move on this part. This is not necessarily, in my mind, a sound design or a production move. I just thought that with all of these aggressive parts, there was a lot of frequency stuff happening in that mid-range, and we use spaces and energy panner to soften that out and make this rise just a little bit easier on the ears. Without. And with. It's pretty great, and I'm going to refine that a little bit, but that's going to be it's going to be very cool when it's all said and done.
I mean, Clear Mountain Spaces adds that space, and Energy Pan just brings those sounds alive. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, to Ross's point, he put it really succinctly. It helps humanize otherwise digital sounding sources. Like if we think about what convolution reverb is, it's really just allowing you to imprint the sound of another space upon your own recording, right? And similarly with all of what you were describing earlier with brightness and dynamic panner, there's truth of how people move and how they perform that can be, you know, added as an algorithm. It doesn't have to be captured at the time of the source, especially if the source is digital MIDI data.
Right. Yeah. Good point. You know, that's one last segue. We won't go too deep into it, but there was this initial sound that Ross has in the session, which was actually made using the standalone application that we make, George. It's called Sound Particles. It's basically CGI for sound. And this is how he created that initial sound. And I don't even know how many particles he's using there, but thousands of them for
10,459. If you guys can just hear this, it may not play back, but that's just an ARP. Can you guys hear that?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's just like a simple ARP. And then I turned it into this. So sick.
Nice.
Yeah, that is this, just to remind you. And it turns your sound source into, in this instance, a 15-second region into 10,459 particles. This is like granular synthesis on steroids, and it doesn't have any of that artifact smearing sound quality problem. It's just butter smooth, like a hot knife through butter. So this is another amazing plugin. And gosh, you can just, again, like you just go down the rabbit hole of pairing this rendered down piece of music of that arpeggio, and then, you know, put that into spaces, put some, you know, air or density panner on that, and you're going to the races, and then sidechain the shit out of it to some beats. It's just, it gets really cool, really fun, really fast.
Thanks, Ross. The reason why I want to showcase Sound Particles 2, which is a standalone workstation, right? So our company is named after that. The reason why I brought it up is because what we do very well in this is, again, like Ross said, it's CGI for sound. You can create that one, take that one sound and turn it into 10,000 or 20,000 or a million particles or brand new sounds. But what we do not do inside Sound Particles is reverbs and delays and pre-delays. That's what Apogee and, you know, Clear Mountain Spaces does very well. So just like Ross did, you can bring in something into Sound Particles, create a texture out of it, take it back to your DAW, let it be Logic or Cubase or Pro Tools, whatever it might be, and then add Clear Mountain Spaces. Now you have all these 10,000 particles embedded into this amazing Clear Mountain Spaces. So again, to use Ross's quote, the sky is the limit.
Yeah. It's a very exciting time in digital audio and just like production in general, and like marrying the world of acoustic instruments and electronic instruments. It's just really exciting time for music making. And it has been that way for years, and it's just going to get better and better.
Yeah. So guys, any closing thoughts before we go into Q&A? George, Ross?
Yeah, I know Ross alluded this earlier, but you know, obviously Bob Clearmountain was heavily involved in Clear Mountain Spaces and Domain. And one of the things I think I asked him one time when we were sitting around having coffee and pizza was like, hey, what is your favorite preset? And Clear Mountain looks at me and he's like, I don't like presets, man. I don't care for that kind of thing. We make them there because I want people to understand the thought process that went behind certain things that I've worked on. And so people can get that inspiration. But like, I really want that to be a starting point for someone. I don't want it to be the end point of this. I want to see what they can do with it and where they can take it. If someone says, oh, I used your preset on this song, that's much less interesting to me than saying, oh my God, I put this on something that's a totally different genre of music than I ever thought it could be. And like, wow, what a cool thing they were able to make with it. So I want to encourage you to always, this is the most basic piece of sound advice ever, but follow your ears, right? Your way of hearing music and your taste is the most important part of your creativity. And these tools are something to use along that path.
Absolutely. That's a great point. So you guys cannot do that with the Reverb plugin, but what we could do with the Panner plugin, and what we've done it very well, is the randomizer button. So if you have a sound and you're like, I don't know what to do with it, roll the dice. So there's a dice icon in almost all of our plugins. You can randomize settings to get a starting point, right? So instead of using just another preset, like George said, you can either start from scratch or just roll the dice and say, give me a starting point, and then tweak that to match your music or your creative intent. So that's a dice right all the way down. There you go. That's
Can we roll the dice real quick on this part?
Let's do it. There you go.
Super cool. There's some neat ideas in there already.
I know. And Ross, before I hand the mic over to you, proverbially, I just want to give you a huge shout out and thank you so much, Ross. Everyone, Ross is an amazing composer. Like I said before, he has a little over 600 million streams. He's done games, movies, music of many genres. Please look him up, show him some love. He's someone we admire and respect a lot. So thank you so much, Ross. And with that shout out, any final thoughts you have before we jump into Q&A?
Oh, for me, or well, gosh, just there's an abundance of tools out there, and just don't ever hesitate to look under the hood of them and turn some knobs, turn some sliders, learn new chords. Just keep learning and keep chugging along, because it's a long game out there. So yeah, just keep changing the process, and keep doing the things that you love, but also flavoring it up with new ideas and new ways to approach music making. That's all I would give a little 2 cents on right there.
You're the best. Thank you, Ross. With that, let's get Joao back on camera with any questions he might have from our amazing audience.
Hello, guys. So there is this request to hear something in binaural. And if you don't mind, Ross, I think maybe the riser could be a good thing to put the energy panel in binaural, just for people to hear it.
Sure, let's do that. Solo. And right now we've been working in a mid side. Just do this drop down menu, the binaural. Wow. Let's go back to MS just for kicks. And then back to binaural. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank
you,
Ross. More
enveloping.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I think so. Especially in headphones, it really gets it cool. So there are a lot of compliments on your track. So really,
thank you.
A lot of love on your track. And there is a question for George. They are asking if Apogee plugins work without hardware. I already said yes, but maybe you can develop on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our objective really has always been to make it so that if there is a tool that helps, you're not actually chained to our hardware to use it. I mean, even with our stuff on DSP, it has only ever been there as a way of helping the creative process. We're not like some other companies where you have to use the hardware in order to get access to the plugins. I think in truth, the idea of that, Shark processor from the 90s inside of a audio interface as being somehow more powerful than your computer is pretty funny. So yeah, luckily you can always use Apogee plugins regardless of what hardware platform you decide to be on.
Awesome. There are not many more questions. Anything that seemed like I didn't answer, please send us an email, because we will answer really fast. And maybe I can go to our discount code. Tony?
Yes.
Okay.
Go for it.
And our giveaway winner. So our giveaway winner is Mauricio Flores Vargas. And our discount code is extra 10, and it's available in all products. And if you take advantage of the 25% off that we have right now, you can accumulate with this extra 10 discount code and get a 35% off in all our products. And I want to give a big shout out to Apogee, to George, and to Ross. It was amazing to see this. Really cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. Once again, Ross, huge shout out to this amazing music. Like everyone said, the track sounds brilliant. Keep writing more music. Thank you so much for joining us. And George and Betty and everyone at Apogee, thank you so very much for collaborating with us on this webinar. So on behalf of everyone at Sound Particles and everyone who joined, thank you so much. And until next time.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Take care now.
Everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, George.